senior honors project today to you all. I'm not going to read the title again since you've already heard it. But first, a little bit about me. I ended up sort of collecting majors in college instead of changing my majors. I came up with Luther not intending to speak Norwegian in any sense. Took one class, met Maren Johnson, and I was kind of hooked. And so now I kind of look ahead to my future as a future and current Norwegian teacher. And I wanted to find a way to kind of find the intersection of ways that I can combine all of my different interests, including math and data science, which are my other majors. So that's going to be the topic for today. And I wanted to start off first by looking at a quote from David Noonan, who is an Australian linguist. And he said in 1991 in a book that he published, "It has been realized that there never was and probably never will be a language method for all. And the focus in recent years has been on the development of classroom tasks and activities which are consonant with what we know about second language acquisition, and which are also in keeping with the dynamics of the classroom itself." And this quote is important to this project because I think it demonstrates the shift that I felt throughout the course of the year that I was working on this, where it was a shift from trying to find the optimal pedagogical method to apply to this specific class, and really shifting over to what was more looking for ways that I can best meet student needs in the classroom as a language instructor. So first I'm going to touch a bit on the methodology and the research framework here. So overall, this class was the third semester Norwegian language class, Norwegian 201 here at Luther. We had 12 students, and what we did is we had 5 isolated grammar lessons, each 20 minutes in duration. So we pulled out 5 different topics from the course curriculum, and for each of these topics, we had a unique isolated pedagogical method to associate with that topic, trying to find the best topics and match them with each of these strategies. So getting a little more specific here, and I apologize for any of you who don't speak Norwegian, there is an English translation, but the topics that we chose were a verb review, looking at time expressions, also looking at short answers to yes or no questions, transitive and intransitive verbs, and then finally adverbs of manner. So all of these different topics are pulled from the Norwegian curriculum, things that need to be taught anyways in regards to this class. For each of these lessons, these were the pedagogical methods that we chose. And kind of going over them a little bit quickly, just due to time, I'm happy to talk about them more later, but cooperative language learning focuses on trying to find small groups, activities that we can use to better promote language learning. Grammar translation is a very traditional method where you're looking more at written translation to and from the target language. You also have things like the direct method, which takes more of an immersion approach, where all of the instruction is done in the target language. We also had more unorthodox approaches, like total physical response, which is associating physical movements with language concepts, and then also looking at things like the cognitive code method, which looks at grammar rules and pattern recognition and seeing how we can use those for language learning. So with these lessons, we also had to decide how we were going to assess the performance of each lesson. So this was done in a post-assessment survey of 7 questions that I split mostly into quantitative and qualitative data. And so students filled out this survey after each lesson, and all of the quantitative data is self-assessed, like I said, from these students on a Likert scale from 1 to 10. So for example, question 1 would have been, rate on a scale from 1 to 10 how familiar you were with the topic before the lesson. We also looked at how well the students understood the lesson or the concept after the lesson, also looking at how well they participated in the lesson and how engaging the lesson was as well. A quick note on the prior familiarity data here. So these 4 metrics are kind of the key data that I'm going to use for the results here. And prior familiarity ended up kind of serving as a proxy for a difficulty rating, which may seem a bit like a leap at first, but when we think about the fact that the less familiar that a student is with a topic going into the lesson, the less knowledge they have bringing in, and so are then going to have more difficulty understanding the topic. And so while ideally I would have just included a question saying, rate the difficulty of this topic from 1 to 10, prior familiarity sort of serves as a difficulty metric proxy here. Then with the qualitative data, we had 3 questions here. The biggest priority here was the lesson descriptors, which was just asking for 3 adjectives to describe the lesson in more of a qualitative sense. These were used for word clouds and other visualizations to describe sort of qualitatively what a lesson might have been characterized as. And we also asked students the main point of the lesson, the key takeaway, and then also any additional comments or observations. Most of my time today is going to be spent on the quantitative data. The qualitative data was really on a lesson-by-lesson basis, and so due to time restrictions, it's difficult to incorporate that in more of a general sense over the course of the entire study. So looking into our results here, first I'm going to put up a plot, a box plot of each of the four metrics that the four main quantitative metrics that we had over the course of the entire study. So these are over the course of all 5 lessons. And I think the biggest observation that we can make right at the start is looking at the difference between prior familiarity and the other 3 metrics here. So the interesting thing with our assessment method is that all of the metrics are rated on the same scale, right? It's a subjective scale from 1 to 10, and so we can actually compare, at least to a certain degree, across these 4 metrics. And when we look at the prior familiarity, we can see that it has the largest spread of the data by far of the 4 metrics. And especially compared to the other 3, it also has lower median and lower average results as well. And so one thing I think is interesting to observe here is when we're looking at all this data, prior familiarity is the only question that students are asked that has no real value judgment associated with it. If a student responds that they're less familiar with the topic, they can't do anything about that before the lesson. It's just the reality of it. It's expected in a language classroom. And so there's no real judgment coming from that. Whereas if you were to if a student were to, for example, respond with a 6 or a 7 on the participation rating instead of an 8 or a 9, that's almost admitting to themselves that they could have participated to a greater degree in the lesson, but they didn't for whatever reason. This same sort of value judgment can be seen in the understanding as well, especially when we consider that our identities as students are often sort of correlated. Our self-worth sometimes maybe is associated with how well we're doing, how well we're understanding a topic. And then the other thing is looking at the engagingness rating of a lesson. Keeping in mind that the students were submitting these surveys to me, knowing I would extensively evaluate them, it's not so hard to understand that students maybe didn't want to rate a lesson as not very engaging, knowing that I would be the one looking at all of that data. So, whether we're looking at spread through like an interquartile range or standard deviation, we can see that the prior familiarity is by far the greatest spread. And then we have a bit of a jump down to the post-lesson understanding, again a decrease to the individual participation, and then finally as well to the engagingness there. So this is looking at the metrics over the course of the entire semester, but I also wanted to look at separating them a little bit by each of the individual lessons. And so the first trend to point out here is that we can see again this high value, low spread trend in the bottom 2 plots, the individual participation and the engagingness ratings. So we see again that low spread and that high value that we saw in the previous plot. But I think the more interesting trend to look at here is looking at the prior familiarity over the course of the semester. We can see that there's a very distinct trend of we have higher values at the start of the semester and then there's decreasing towards the end of the semester. And this makes total sense if you think about it, right? In a language classroom, we're going to be introducing unfamiliar topics, right? It's just the nature of the course. And so it makes a lot of sense that we see that trend. The interesting thing, though, is that we can also see the same type of trend in the post-lesson understanding data as well. Although it certainly is to a lesser degree, we don't see as big of a shift in the values, we do see that there's the same sort of trend. And so this got me thinking, well, what might we see in terms of correlation effects when we're looking at the data? So I created what's called a scatter plot matrix here. And stay with me, humanities people, if this is we're going to get a little data centric here for a little bit, but it's okay, I promise we'll make it. So the scatter plot matrix here is looking for correlation effects, seeing if we have a low value in one metric, if that tends to have also a low value in another metric. And out of all of the pairings here of these 4 metrics, there is actually only one relationship that is statistically significant, and that is the relationship between prior familiarity and post-lesson understanding. So zooming in on the plot here, we do see a statistically significant correlation effect between these 2 metrics. And this relationship is a positive, moderately strong correlation effect, indicating that if we have a lower prior familiarity score, then we tend to see lower understanding scores, and a higher prior familiarity score leads to higher understanding scores, is what we also see there. And so thinking about this, seeing how we might see that type of effect, it made me wonder if the data scientists and me, seeing if we can maybe even predict this post-lesson understanding metric, seeing if we can predict that using the other metrics here, including the 4 that we've talked about, in addition to also seeing if the variation between lessons and pedagogical techniques would also have an effect there. And so I promise I'm not going to go into any huge modeling here, but essentially over a bunch of different models, linear models, polynomial models and things, what I found is that we were not able to accurately or successfully predict closed lesson understanding to any greater degree than about 50% with any of my predictor variables here. And the other thing to point out here is that in all of the models that I tried, prior familiarity was a more significant predictor than the actual pedagogical technique, than the lessons themselves here. So looking at my conclusions here then, what does this actually tell us about language pedagogy? Well, first, it makes us think about these pedagogical methods, kind of coming back to that original quote that I started with here. It seems that for this group of students, it seems that the pedagogical method was not really as influential in student understanding as prior familiarity to a topic or difficulty of that topic. The other interesting thing here as well is that oftentimes in language classrooms, when we're thinking about language pedagogy, a lot of the time, we're thinking of things from an instructor perspective, right? The instructor has a syllabus, they have a curriculum that they need to teach by, so they find a successful way to teach a topic and sort of kind of impose that framework on a class. But here, where we're getting, because of the assessment methods here, it's a self-assessment and it's a subjective assessment, which means that we actually have a unique student perspective on this language pedagogy. And I think what this shows is that for this group of students, rather than trying to find the optimal language method, whatever that would even mean, what we rather need to do is look at student needs and classroom needs and how best we can prioritize those specific needs instead of looking for the best way to teach one topic universally to every group of people. So looking ahead to changing for any further research, things that I would go back and change. First of all, definitely the time. 20 minutes is way too short for any of these types of lessons. I was already bleeding over into 30 minutes and beyond, and so I think either removing the duration altogether or significantly increasing that would definitely be beneficial. I also would want to change the assessment methods. In addition to adding the difficulty question I mentioned earlier, also adding informative assessments like test scores, quizzes, things like that, and seeing how those two types of data are related would be really interesting, I think. And then finally, I think shifting the focus. Again, as I've sort of reiterated, the focus of this study, I think this type of research should not be on finding the best pedagogical method, the best way to teach something, but rather looking specifically for, in the case of intermediate Norwegian, looking at specific strategies when teaching these particular grammar topics, not any topic in particular, and also looking for the best ways that we can prioritize student needs and classroom needs to foster a great learning environment. So here are my references. Thank you.
Yeah. I guess I'll just say, since the man who taught me how to appreciate character and pedagogy, Jeff Wilkerson, is sitting right here. I was really intrigued by this, and I would love to hear you say more about, now that you've gotten really, I think, pretty deeply and pretty well into this sort of work. Where do you see this research and your combination of interests taking you? What's next?
Well, so I'm a current Norwegian instructor at Vesterheim downtown online, and so I've noticed that one thing for me is that I tend to, especially with these online classes, that there's not as much interaction between student and teacher. There tends to be a point where you get a slideshow made, and then that's just the slideshow you use for every single section. And I think where this is kind of taking me is showing that rather than thinking about that from my perspective and how I can minimize the work that I need to do and sort of make that the most efficient for me, I think I need to think more about in the future prioritizing groups of students rather than just using the same exact slideshow. And so for me, what that looks like is in the future, I plan to go to grad school, looking to teach in Norwegian full-time potentially later on. And so thinking about how I can maybe conduct research in my own classes later on to see what other things I can find, because ultimately this is just a fascinating topic. And so I greatly enjoyed my time that I spent with all of this data.
Does prior understanding refer just to knowledge of, in this case, the Norwegian language, or might it include other things like an effective teacher obviously scaffolds their lessons so that they are building that sort of thing, but also they learn how to sort of speak the language of the student or tap into a fluency with the student. Does it include those kinds of things?
Yeah, great question. I think it comes down more to the actual wording of the question. And so in the survey that we administered, I believe the wording was rate on a scale from 1 to 10 how familiar you were with the lesson topic before the lesson. And so ultimately, due to the subjective nature of the assessment, we can't be exactly sure how each student would have necessarily answered that question, whether it would include things like, oh, I've seen this construct before. Because remember, they're completing this after the fact, and so they're not necessarily, like, you're not just getting a name of a grammar topic and then just like rating if you ever heard that name before. You're learning the construction, and so if you've seen that before in your own personal life, whether that's in the class or just in your own work, they could have rated themselves as more familiar. However, I think this is exactly a place where a different type of assessment method would tell us better, because I think using things, something like, for example, a pre-test and a post-test, where we can compare more like objective data on like, okay, if a student understands this metric, then we're gonna say that they can get a certain percentage on this quiz that we make, and we're gonna have them take it beforehand and after, and see like what the difference in understanding is there. And so I think it definitely kind of plays into the assessment methods, and changing that going forward, it would definitely be something that I would look to.